Minasan, konnichiwa, Sherlock desu, and welcome to part 3 of my Iaido self-study challenge. Firstly, I'm hoping to clear up some points that seem to have caused confusion from the last videos, as well as covering some of the interesting discoveries I have made along the way. First of all, a huge thank you to everyone who took the time to write to me for constructive conversation, and even those that were less constructive, as even some of that has been able to help. This series has not been aimed to advocate self-learning over going to a proper dojo. Nothing compares to the wisdom, overseeing, understanding and guidance of a proper sensei. Neither is this series a means for me to show off my skills without even having to attend an Iaido dojo. Without attending a proper dojo for real study, I will never be an Iaido student or be able to make the advances that a proper dojo would enable. And so with that covered, I'd like to move on to the main part of this video, which is covering all of the grounds that I have learnt and experienced whilst going through this challenge. Firstly, dissecting the technique to truly understand how each individual part works on its own. Breaking a technique or kata into sections to practice individually helps to build an understanding of how each part functions and the effect that it is supposed to have. However, do remember that the sections need to fit back together and flow naturally, so pausing in a stop-start fashion creates poor and unnatural movements. Bad habits are created very easily and also can go unnoticed for a long time. One of the most important parts of a dojo is the other trainees and teachers around you, who can observe the students' training and development, correcting mistakes where necessary. When training alone, this precious and necessary input does not exist. As a result, bad habits and poor technique can creep in and go unnoticed. This makes these habits much harder to find, break, and correct. Lacking a real opponent can create unrealistic movements. Much like lacking a teacher can have important lessons missed, having no opponent can create strange or unrealistic movements. Having only an imaginary opponent leaves the student to decide their own opponent's movements and reactions. The main problem being that a real opponent will move in ways that the student cannot predict, and so lead to further lessons being learned. Without this, a student whose only opponent is themselves leads to some strange outcomes. You have to be able to spot your own mistakes and be able to correct them. Self-training comes with an inherent problem. A lack of starting knowledge creates huge and even insurmountable issues as training progresses. Even with prior knowledge of a similar martial art, small details can still go unnoticed. Just because something appears to be similar does not mean it is the same. For example, even among Japanese sword-based martial arts, there are many different ways of simply holding the sword. This means when starting a new style as against learning it from scratch, it can be difficult not to fall into the trap of using only the familiar style. This can lead to missing important details from the new art. Spotting these mistakes becomes harder and harder as a lone student progresses. The usual process of unaware incompetence, aware incompetence, aware competence, and unaware competence is vastly dragged out due to each stage becoming harder to surpass. Especially the first of becoming aware that the student is even making a mistake. understanding the reasoning, principles, and story behind a technique. When looking at a technique, inside and out of the dojo, ask yourself some questions about what exactly the technique is trying to teach you, as well as looking deeper into the movements, reasoning, timing, distance, and all other variables that it shows. Then ask how, why, where, and when to each of those until you can truly answer with understanding that stands up to scrutinous testing of each of the questions to each principle. Each technique and kata also tells a story. To develop them beyond just repeated patterns of movement, you need to look deeper into their reasoning. A technique is not just an answer to a situation, but one of many examples that a student learns throughout their martial arts career. Look at individual movements and body parts. It can be very easy when training alone, and even in a dojo, to get distracted by the main part of the technique, especially when a weapon is involved. When concentrating on swinging a sword, it can be all too easy to forget the correct footwork and to let mistakes creep in. Therefore, it is important to understand the movements each part of the body should be performing and to understand their function. Without correct form, martial arts are useless. When training alone, it will take a very long time for any progress to be made. Ordinary training in a dojo under the careful supervision of a sensei can still take many years for good progress. This progression is much slower and vastly more difficult for a lone student. What a sensei may teach in only a couple of hours may take a lone student days or even weeks to figure out, practice, and perfect. That is, of course, if their training is even on the right track. It takes a lot of patience, self-discipline, and understanding to make any real progress when training alone. This can be made easier if the student has previous experience in another martial art or one that is similar, but vastly more difficult if it is a person with no martial arts experience. I will be continuing my self-training of Iaido, and am currently in talks to be able to try out an Iaido style grading as a real test of what I have learned and how far I have come. If you would like to see my previous videos, click the annotation here and you'll be taken to the previous one. And as always, I am Sherlock. 皆さん、見るありがとうございました。後で会いましょう。I will be continuing to... Yes. I think I got that right.